We're starting off our exploration of asana with relation to hamstrings because hamstrings seem to be one of the most popular, sought after areas of the body to want to stretch. So let's get right into looking at a pose that is directed towards lengthening the hamstrings. Now, the target area is quite simply the hamstrings. The purpose is to lengthen the hamstrings. Now, what we want to look at is what is the action that creates the lengthening in the hamstrings. And I know this might seem super basic, but just stay with me because it really does inform everything that we're going to be doing that we've already explored in terms of modifications, cueing, and sequencing. So the action that creates the lengthening of the hamstring is to take a leg or both and move them closer towards the front of the body and farther away from the back of the body. So we are decreasing this space here and we're increasing the space between the back of the leg and the back of the body. That is, in the most simple terms, the action that is behind any yoga poses that target or involve or are intended for the purposes of lengthening the hamstrings. Now let's look at the biomechanics of this pose. What are the muscles that support this action of lifting the leg or bringing the leg closer to the front of the body and bringing it further away from the back of the body? What are the muscles that support this movement? Well, as I already showed, the primary muscles are going to be through the opposite area, the area of the body that is opposite to the area, the hamstrings, that we are intending to lengthen. So we've got the thigh here, a little bit of into the hip flexor as well. Now, just depending on what sort of variation and what sort of way you're helping your students to explore this type of pose or this type of movement or this type of action, it might also involve a little bit of core strengthening as well to create the lengthening through the back of the body. Now, as we've already explored, the common approach, especially when it comes to a hamstring stretch, is to force. This is so evident in almost every single forward folding yoga pose or every single yoga pose where the target area or one of the target areas is to stretch the hamstrings. We pull in a forward fold. We pull in a wide-legged forward fold. We pull in a seated forward fold. We get down on the back and we pull the leg. In splits, the whole floor is holding the leg up as the hips lower down. There are so many ways in which we are often forcing 99.9% of the time, I would even argue 100% of the time, where we are using the hands or gravity or a prop or the floor in some way to force the body into a hamstring stretch. Now, as we already explored, this force can take the body into a range of motion that is not actually sustainable or healthy for the long-term conditioning of our joints. Because, as a reminder, what happens, the force needs to be absorbed by the body in some way. So when we take the hands and we push the body into a particular position of flexibility, this creates, again, a blind spot. Versus if we were to let go of the hands. Looking at how the hands pull the body into position means that a lot of times the tendons and the ligaments are not going to be supported by the natural activation of the muscles that are required to do the action, and therefore we've got unnecessary stress and strain on the tendons and the ligaments, which again can lead to injury and destabilization of the joints over time, not to mention just a very unhealthy, dysfunctional range of motion in the body. And a lot of times we only really need a certain amount of hamstring flexibility to get around in our lives, for our lives to be functional and for us to have a healthy body that can last a long time. Usually the hamstring flexibility that we are seeking or chasing in a yoga practice is purely for the purposes of performing a pose. Getting the body into a certain position, it has nothing to do with health or well-being past a certain range of motion. Now, as I already mentioned, hamstrings are one of those areas of the body that so many people really want to stretch. However, given the fact that most poses in yoga use force to generate hamstring flexibility, coupled with the fact that going beyond a certain range just really is not necessary or functional for everyday life, there is a very common injury that you might have heard of called yoga butt. I have suffered from this myself from so many years of forceful hamstring stretching. Why? Because I thought that's what it meant to do yoga properly. I thought that's what it meant to be healthy. I thought that the deeper I went into my practice, the more I brought my legs closer towards my body in a hamstring focused pose, then the healthier I would be. Then the more benefits I'm going to get from my practice and the more well off I'll be in the long run, because I was thinking that there's such a relevant importance to being as flexible as possible. Even though I was still combining that with strength, I was going into a range of motion that was actually not very functional for my body in the long run. And this is something that most of your yoga students are probably doing. You might even be doing it yourself in your practice. But again, we have to understand the biomechanics of the body. When the body is forced into going into a position, it goes into a very guarded position. It doesn't go into something where there is a willing lengthening of the tissues. We've got blind spots that we have to consider, where the range of motion that is achieved by forcing the body and the range of motion that is achieved by not forcing the body creates a very big gap, a blind spot, where there's a disconnect and there's an increased risk of injury for your students. Now, when we look at the somatic cueing of something like a hamstring stretch or a pose where we're encouraging our students to connect with a stretching feeling into the backs of the legs, it's really important to remember that the sensation, the somatic sensation of someone feeling a stretch does not equal benefits. And on the flip side of that, if someone is not feeling a stretch, it doesn't mean that they aren't getting lengthening of the tissues in the hamstrings. The deeper the stretch, the more substantial the stretch, the more the stretch is being felt in the body, does not in any way, shape, or form equate to the value that that pose or that movement holds for someone. What starts to be a little bit damaging in the long run is how often your students will chase the stretch, chase that sensation of stretching. And as I already mentioned, it gets to a point where the range of motion is so vast that it is very detrimental to the tendons and the ligaments over time. So again, just because the sensation of stretch isn't there does not mean that the body is not getting lengthening, because we're looking at the biomechanics. We're looking at the way that the body communicates, as I already demonstrated with the example earlier, which is to bring the food into the mouth. This has to lengthen in order for this to contract and perform this action. The same thing applies with a hamstring stretch. Just the simple act of taking the angle of the leg, and as we said, to create a lengthening in the back of the leg, we lift the leg closer to the front of the body and further away from the back of the body. Just that simple action is enough to lengthen those tissues. It doesn't matter whether we feel the stretch or not. The feeling of the stretch is not indicative of the benefits or the value that one is going to receive from doing that type of movement. And that's why within this method, we focus on engaging the body in the primary foundational action of lifting the leg, which inherently naturally creates the lengthening of the tissues into the back of the hamstring. We don't need to force the body. We don't need to push and shove a square peg into a round hole. We can, as we're going to explore, go hands-free, and that will encourage the tissues to lengthen to the degree that they need to, because we're utilizing internal strength via lifting the leg using these muscles instead of external force, which is pulling and pushing and shoving with the hands. So as already mentioned, for a more sustainable and more holistic approach, an approach to hamstring lengthening that really does allow the body to be honored within its natural biomechanics and the way that it communicates within the muscles, we don't need to use the hands. We can just go hands-free. And I'm going to show you some basic preparations that will add so much variety into your class to help your students access this type of movement. So when we look at some basic hamstring invitational openings and stretches on the back, where we can choose to instruct our students to use force or not, here's something that you might do. Just get your students to lengthen the leg up towards the ceiling. So I will cue this something like this. Go ahead and kick your left leg up towards the ceiling. You can choose whether you want to flex the foot towards the face or point the toes. This, just as a side note, is something that you can do to help them tinker with variables. If you find that it's very difficult for you to have your leg above you in a lengthened position, notice how I'm not saying straight, I'm saying lengthen, because it doesn't have to be straight. It's just that the student needs to have the intention to lengthen the leg outward. It could mean that the knee is bent, that's fine, just as long as they can. But if you find it's very difficult to lengthen your leg above you and your leg is further away from you than it is towards you, or your knee is quite bent, go ahead and pop your hands underneath your bum or even use a prop underneath your bum. Then that way it gives them a little bit more access into the hamstring. Then I cue them to kick either the heel or, as I said before, point the toes up towards the ceiling and work on lengthening and extending the leg as much as they possibly can. I'll then go on to say, notice how this feels when you keep your right knee bent. Notice how this feels when you start to send your right heel a little bit further away from the bum. Then you can also observe how it feels when you straighten your right leg fully. And if your left leg comes away from you, you might choose to put a little bit of a bend back into your right knee again. Then from here, I encourage them to either stay where they are or play around with some variables of pulsing or exploring more of their expansion, which could be tapping the heel down and then drawing the leg towards the body. We can also go into a hold position where they intentionally try to keep the leg straight and then they just draw the leg towards the body. Now I will point out, if you're lifting your hips up to get the leg towards the body, this is where you might need hands or a higher prop underneath your lower back or your sacrum area. So the idea is that they're utilizing the strength through the front of the leg here to speak to the lengthening of the tissues into the back of the leg. These tissues become a lot more willing and happy to lengthen because they're being supported by their opposite partner here. So again, we can work on some pulses, we can work on exploring more full expansion and moving through each kind of action here, or we can find some holding. And then you can add so many different things on top of that. Things with the arms, above, beside, whatever you would like to play around with. You can also do this from a seated position where you have your students land one foot down with the other leg in front of the body, and then they're going to proceed to lift this leg up. So I'll cue it something like this. From a seated position, draw the left heel close in towards the body. If you find that you want to keep your hands off the mat, go ahead. Otherwise, land your hands down to the ground behind you. See how landing your hands down or even just leaning your body back allows you to create a little lift in your right leg. Toes can be flexed, toes can be pointed. It doesn't matter how high your leg goes, but the intention is to keep it off the ground and to lengthen it outward as much as is possible for your body, as much as feels valuable for your body. See how I'm threading that word valuable into this? Now you can talk to the shaking, the muscle activation that's taking place, and this is a really great opportunity to tell your students and explain to your students what's happening. So I'll often say something like this. You might feel that there's a great sensation into the right quadricep muscle, the right hip flexor. Notice how it feels to move your foot around. That might be a little bit of a distraction or a little bit of a way to just keep your attention here. If that leg is shaking to the point where you're not able to hold it up anymore, you can lean your body back more and it will become easier to lift the leg up. If you would like to explore a variation that maybe has a different value for you or changes where you're feeling this in the body, you can bring the leg more down, bring the hands more forward, and then even bring your left foot more forward. Further to that, the more you bring your body forward, the more you're going to incorporate the core, and you'll actually be asking a lot more of this thigh. The whole time, this activation is creating the messaging to lengthen through the tissues of the back of this leg. You can do the same thing from a position like this. Leaning back will make it much easier to lift the leg up, whereas coming forward is going to be a lot more challenging usually to lift the leg up because of the degree of angle that is being created with the body coming closer towards the leg. So you're going to use all the same cues as you did when I had the legs forward. You're just going to get your students to play around in this way with the hands more forward, the hands more back. Again, toes pointed, flexed. The height of the leg is irrelevant, and you can get your students to then lower the body down. This can be a long hold. This can be a lift and a tap. This can be pulses up and down. And then again, on top of that, you've got all these different variables with the upper body to play with, if that's something that is suitable. But for now, we're just focusing on the basics of this because this is basic preparations for hamstrings. Another way that you can cue this is from a kneeling position. Same thing, play around with toes pointed, toes flexed. Encourage your students to lengthen the leg. It's not about the height of the leg, it's really about the fact that it stays in the air and the fact that it is as lengthened as they possibly can, or what feels valuable for them. Now, I'm using 2 blocks here because it makes it easier, but the same thing applies. The more the body is upright, generally the easier it is to lift this leg. The more that the torso comes closer towards the thigh, the harder generally it's going to be to hold that leg up. So this is where you can give your students the options and the cues for them to connect with an outcome. Do they want to create a little bit more mobility in their body? Are they feeling like they're wanting to engage in something that's perhaps unfamiliar to them, uncharted territory, or explore into something that's maybe a little bit uncomfortable for them? Or are they wanting to prioritize their breathing and lift the leg only to the point where they feel that they can still really breathe super calmly? I always encourage that anyways, maintaining a calm breath, a relaxed breath, and keeping the face nice and relaxed as well. You can play around with different things, lifting and lowering the leg, coming into pulses. You can play around with adding some variations within the arms as well. These are all different variables that you can encourage your students to play around with in that basic kneeling preparation. And as we already explored, a standing variation of this. And again, all the same things apply. So the more someone tips the body back, generally the more accessible it's going to be and easier for them to lift their leg up. Then they can decide if they want to explore coming forward and how that changes things. So we really went from, the floor upright to be able to change the orientation of the movement, to be able to add variety and diversity and help your students find different ways to access this type of activation, which naturally creates the release through the opposing area of the body in a way that is aligned with our body's biomechanics. And the great thing about all these basic preparations for hamstring focused poses is that the preparation is the modification. The preparation is the variation. And what I mean by that is that you do not have to go into a subsequent forced flexibility pose after all this. You can choose to. Really depends on what you want to offer for your students in your sequence. But just understanding how the body works, there will be a natural lengthening into the backs of the legs that comes as a result of not using force to create flexibility and just engaging in the movement that we just did. As I said, exploring it with different variables, pulsing, moving, stillness, big ranges, little ranges, playing around with the arms, what's happening with the foot, what's happening with the chest, all of these different ways to tinker with variables that informs your student to feel into their body, to understand what's going on, because you can speak to what's actually happening through the activation as the leg lifts, creating the release. All these things inform your students so that they can create a practice for themselves that is personalized and that is very customizable for their personal needs. And what's great about this is that those students that want to really force their flexibility and they want to push the hamstring flexibility, and maybe their primary concern is not, is this sustainable for my body, or maybe that's just not something that they're interested in or they've bought into at this point in time, this method still works for them because it actually helps them lead into a safer place of flexibility, because it invites the body, it invites the back of the body into having a little bit more willingness through the muscle to be able to lengthen if that's something that they want to do. On the flip side of that, as I've already said, if that is not something that you as a teacher are offering for your students or that you're encouraging, I rarely offer forced options for my students. I will speak to it, but if you as a teacher are wanting to align a little bit more with the sustainability component, then again, this is doing it, while also at the same time providing your students with the intention that they likely have to create some opening and spaciousness into the backs of the legs. Now, as much as I think it is incredibly important to empower your students to do what's right for them and connect with their needs and align with their intentions, I also have a very high value in the sustainability component of a practice. So I will thread these two things in, and in relation to a hamstring stretch, if I see that a student is really eager to grab and pull, I will say, if you feel that using force via pulling your body into this position, if you feel that using force to create flexibility is valuable for you, then that's something that you've got to listen in and explore and tune into. However, it is important that you understand that your body actually has a built-in system for natural flexibility, one that allows you to actually honor the body, the tissues, the joints, in a way that is much more sustainable and provides longevity within your physical body, not just for your practice, but for your life as well. So I know that's quite long-winded, but that is just some sort of reference and example of how you can share and support both kinds of students. And I know that there's more than just two kinds. There's everyone in between as well, but both. Decide where you want to honor what someone does and how they're going to be able to empower themselves to do what's right for them, but also inform them that there are going to be some risks involved with forcing flexibility, and all you're doing is informing them. At the end of the day, the ball's in their court, and they get to choose what they want to do. So not only can these basic preparations be used just as standalone things, but they can be utilized as a method of breaking up the layers of a pose. So if there is a pose that does target one of many things, and one of those things is the hamstrings, then you can use these basic preparations in your sequence to encourage your students to be able to then more accessibly access and practice that particular pose. Personally, in my own practice, I rarely ever do force my flexibility, especially when it comes to hamstring stretches, because I have incredibly lengthened hamstrings already. I do not need any more of that. They're already quite dysfunctional in nature. Now, when we go into some of the other videos, I'm going to talk about how a lot of these more dynamic ways of practicing asana, where you're encouraging your students to sort of move and play around with some oscillations and some flows rather than just holding in stillness all the time, how this does support the co-activation of the muscles to come to play, which can also actually act as a hamstring strengthener. So when we stretch the hamstrings with this type of approach that I'm presenting to you, it's not just a passive letting go of the muscle. No, the muscle still has a little bit of support and tone to it, which it should, because it acts as a little bit of a barrier, but a willing barrier, a barrier and a slight protection that also is actively, willingly lengthening via the activation through the front of the body to create the action of what creates a hamstring stretch in the first place. So you can use these basic preparations to help your students tinker with all kinds of different variables in their body. As I said, what happens when the chest is up versus when the chest is forward in that leg lift? What happens when the toes are pointed versus when the toes are flexed? In the basic preparation where we were on the back, what happens when the hips lift up versus when the hips drop down? What happens when the arms lift up versus the arms being down? So we're encouraging our students through these basic preparations to tinker with variables so that they can really set the foundations, and we can help them to do that so they understand that every single pose can be shifted, can be tinkered with, can be adapted, can be modified, can be personalized and customized to align with their personal needs and their personal intentions. All of these things help to make the practice of yoga a lot more inclusive and a lot more accessible for your students. And we're going to go into particular poses that are designed to target the hamstrings and look at how we can help our students shift the target area if needed, tinker with variables, flip the orientation of the pose, and just practice in a way that is much more empowering for them and allows you to feel much more confident as a teacher.